Thank you everyone for coming, and welcome Budour, Hassan, for the third time now. And I know we won't have enough time to really show all of your profound knowledge of the situation in Gaza and West Bank. But nevertheless, I would like to begin with a quote from Budour Necropolis, as the theme is Never Again, the universality of Palestinian struggle for justice and human rights. And it will be an example of why this doesn't matter just for the Palestinians, but for each and everyone here as well. And I quote, "Even in our younger years, they stripped away all illusions from our consciousness and accustomed us to expecting a more radical, apocalyptic evil. Those who, as school children, were seized by the panic of the night community, powerless to watch as flames destroyed their theater in the center of Trieste, had their image of the future ruined forever. The bloody sky above the port, the frenzied fascists pouring gasoline on the proud building and then revealing in the violet blaze, all of this was imprinted on the child's mind and traumatized him. And that was only the beginning, because then that boy became guilty, without knowing who or what he had sinned against, as he could not believe that he was being condemned for using the language in which he loved his parents and began to discover the world. The most monstrous thing of all was when the Slovenian people had their first and last names changed, not only those who were alive, but also those in the cemeteries. Well, this quarter century of annulment reached its extreme limit in the camp atmosphere, where people were reduced to numbers." So, this is in the context of, well, Slovenians had a similar experience during the Second World War and before. And this is something which I think resonates with all the Slovenians, in a way, in our collective conscience. And this is where we can begin. So, before we delve into, the genocide in Gaza, could you maybe explain your personal story? Because I know you're the one who are usually giving voices to the untold stories. And it will also be really nice to hear your story and how this has influenced your work. Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'd like to start with what you began this discussion with, the quote, because I think there are two things that really resonate for us, especially if we try to look at a genocide or war on conflict through the perspective or the eyes of a child, how a child perceives it. I, at work, try not to interview children because, as you know, there is specific safeguarding on how to talk to children, and we don't want to re-traumatize children, but I have friends who have children who have basically come of age during the genocide in Gaza. And what you just read from really, I felt almost some pangs in my heart, because these are some words I recall talking with a friend. She has a 7-year-old boy who has obviously not been to school for 2 years because of the genocide in Gaza. And as much as they tried to do remote learning, they couldn't because there are problems with the internet connection. And they tried to do, she is a therapist, so she knows how to deal, or at least she thought she knew how to deal, and she raised other children during wars, so it's not a new experience altogether. But I think she told me that she tried to get him into drawing, and then he would only draw pieces, which for him symbolized the shreds of his people he knew who were killed and torn to shreds. And then at one point, she told me that her child asked her, "So what, did we kill anyone?" That's the child what the child asked. Did we kill anyone? What did we do? What are we punished for? And to have a boy at 7 actually articulate these words, his vocabulary is almost entirely made up of words that are related to conflict, bombing. He knows how to differentiate the bombs through their sounds, and the different kinds of drones, helicopters, F-35s, F-16s. And he tries to talk. He has been worried, even scared about getting out of home. And for him, he likes to do video gaming. He has even as a kid, as a very young child, he's a bit of a geek. And then she said that he has not been the same. And relatively, she said, we're lucky because at least in my case, his father is still alive, I'm alive, his siblings are alive. Yes, he pretty much lost most of his friends were killed or were displaced or left Gaza. But to him, this doesn't make sense. To him, that suddenly he discovered that he's a Palestinian from Gaza at 7. Because he discovered that why are we hated? Why are we being punished? Why are we being condemned? And to think that you just multiply this experience of hundreds of thousands of children who will live with these scars, and even worse. And I don't think we know how to deal with that. We haven't reached the point where we can deal with that just yet, because we need the genocide to end, to start rebuilding, reconstructing the memories, thinking about questions of trauma, of guilt, of even children feeling guilty that they are alive and that their classmates were killed. So, and just to circle back quick to your question, I think since for us, again, we always in Palestine, it's funny in a sense that we come of age during these huge cataclysmic moments for us, political consciousness shaping moments. So I think I was 11 years old when the second Intifada broke out, the second Palestinian uprising. It was 2000, it was the end of September 2000. We had just moved from my small village near Nazareth to Nazareth, and I started hearing in the radio that there were protests. And at the time, I knew about politics, but at the time, there was not much access to internet. Still, very early on, we were learning the word Google still. And I was constantly calling the radio a huge football fan. So I was constantly calling the radio just to actually imitate some of the football commentators. And I was like one of the spoiled children always calling the radio, and all the radio hosts loved me and stuff. Until the second Intifada broke out, and I started calling to talk. And I didn't know what I felt something. I don't come from a particularly politicized home, but we come from a very Palestinian home. We know about occupation, we know about the ethnic cleansing of 1948, Nakba, but it's still the knowledge of a teenager who was just basically most of her life, I loved reading, I loved novels, I loved sports, but really not that politicized. And then I got politicized by watching and then trying to sneak against my parents' wishes without my parents knowing to participate in the protests that were taking place. And then getting more scared that my parents would discover than actually getting beaten by the police at the time. And at the time, 13 people who held Israeli citizenship but who are Palestinian citizens were killed during those protests. And we kept hearing, at the time I started writing poetry, very, very mediocre and bad poetry, about the situation in Palestine, even about Yasser Arafat, about Ammar, and even about Palestinians, children who were killed by Israeli forces. And then from that moment on, that traumatic moment when in Nazareth, the city I moved to, 3 people were killed as they were protesting. And I remember the Israeli authorities shut down the main radio station that was covering the protest. It was called Radio 2000s. And that really made me question everything and start wanting to know. And then I think at the time I was asked, so what do you want to study? And I didn't even know what international law is. I said, I want to study international law because I want to prosecute Ariel Sharon. So that's how it started, really. And then I never managed to prosecute anyone, and I lost.
Not yet.
Not yet, and as you said, a lot of the illusions, what you quoted, were really brushed aside about what international law can or can't do. And some of the utopia I thought, and the idea that you can change the world through law, I went through many phases. But I would like to think that the one constant thing that never changed, even as I aged and even as I probably lost some of my optimistic, passionate side because it got drowned by life, is this unyielding commitment that we will continue to fight for justice. That never died. I hope it will never, but yeah, we will try. Yeah.
And yet you are doing a great work in shaping the understanding of international law as such. In the case of Gaza, you sort of cooperated in preparing the Amnesty report on genocide, 300 pages of that report. And I know this is only a tip of the iceberg, but this is something. So if we move on to your work at Amnesty and how you contributed, or to qualify to what is happening in Gaza nowadays, I mean, since 7th of October. Could you elaborate? We can go through the conditions or illegal elements of the genocide, so you can explain to the people. But let's try to be, we don't have enough time. I mean, but the most vivid examples and, of course, the most important aspects you want to emphasize.
Yeah. So we already at Amnesty published a report, a late report. Usually the thing with human rights organizations, and you also learn that as someone who is myself critical of the human rights framework and its limitations, and I think we always need to look at it tactically as a tool rather than expect human rights are not going to liberate us. However, human rights are going to give us tools to be able to reach audiences that otherwise we would not be able to reach. And so they are important in that sense. So we published that report about defining legally the system that Israel has established and maintained against Palestinians, wherever their rights are controlled by Israel, including Palestinian citizens of Israel, Palestinian, under their different fragmented existences, as a system of apartheid, domination, and institutionalized system of domination and oppression by one racial group against another. And we, at the time, before the genocide happening, we were trying to work on to give evidence, especially work more on proving how that system works, particularly against Palestinian citizens of Israel, because this was one of the aspects criticized in our report that we didn't cover enough. However, then the genocide broke out on the 7th of October. And for us, even then, it was really a challenge. Personally, I think also emotionally, because on the one hand, obviously, since then we've been, as a human rights organization, as Amnesty, we document human rights violations regardless of the perpetrator. So human rights violations, possible war crimes by Hamas and other armed groups, obviously by Israeli authorities, and violations happening in the West Bank by the Palestinian authorities. So this is something that we consistently do and uphold. However, since the 7th of October, we started thinking, yeah, there is something it's not different. We yesterday spoke about the importance of seeing genocide as part of an ongoing process, because genocides are never born out of blue. They have this architecture. Without this architecture, you cannot commit genocide. You need this legal, cognitive, social architecture that allows genocide, that paves the way for genocide to be committed. And we have talked about occupation, apartheid, and also the decades of dehumanization and dispossession, and other episodes of mass killings throughout Palestinian history, even before the Nakba, but also the Nakba of 1948, and other smaller episodes of mass killings, particularly in the 1950s, forcible transfer plans, etc. But then, when we started thinking, okay, so we need to understand, because at the beginning we were only investigating particular airstrikes or particular attacks happening in Gaza. But then we recognized that we need to look more in the full picture of what was happening. And then South Africa filed its case against Israel before the International Court of Justice. And then we were challenged. And we were late, and this is, again, I go back to the point that also Amnesty was late in issuing the apartheid report. I think it was 10 years late. That should have been published. I mean, some Palestinian thinkers spoke about, Saïr, for example, spoke about apartheid as early as the 1960s. So Palestinian thinkers, intellectuals, Palestinian human rights activists have always been at the forefront of naming things as they should really be named. And for whatever reasons, human rights organizations tend to be late. It's the same with genocide. However, maybe just not to defend, but to excuse, or not even to excuse, just to give more context of why Amnesty was late, because we'd never published anything, as Amnesty would never said genocide about any other conflict that was still ongoing. And that's almost, I think, also doesn't say, it's something that we needed to face to it, including when the Rwandan genocide happened. Amnesty said it was genocide after that. So we thought, no, we can't wait until this genocide ends to say that this is genocide. We cannot simply wait until there is a court decision. We need to start researching that. And then based on the cornerstones of some of our work, we thought about investigating some of the 3 main prohibited acts under the Genocide Convention. Now we're trying to also look at a 4th prohibited act, but these were the killing members of the group, causing them bodily or mental harm, and deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction in whole or in part. The 4th act is deliberately imposing measures to prevent births among the group, which we didn't include in our research, but which we are currently working on right now. And then, obviously, as a team, because this is a teamwork, so you need to, as you know, in the genocide, to prove the crime of genocide, what makes it stand out from other crimes under international law, international criminal law, is that there is the double intent that you need to prove, that each and every attack was deliberately committed by the perpetrator, but that there is the specific intent, other than the general intent, the specific intent to destroy the group as such. And this was not easy to work with, because you have a limited jurisprudence by the International Court of Justice, especially when it comes to the responsibility of state, because it's easier to prove responsibility of individuals, but to ascribe responsibility for states can be complicated, because states are kind of an imagined construct. They have different different officials. They can have sometimes these officials can have contradictory statements. States are, how do you even treat a state as an entity? That can be difficult. But this is how we started with. And then as we went, obviously, when it comes to killing, and also because there is something specific about this genocide. Every genocide has its own ways of how killings, especially killings, are handled. The thing is, here the killings are mostly not done by machetes or extrajudicial. There are obviously many cases of extrajudicial killings, but the overwhelming majority of killings are either by remote killings, by drone strikes, by airplanes, warplanes, by bombs falling from the sky, and by modern warfare using obviously also the creation of targets through these
Artificial intelligence.
sinister artificial intelligence tools. And this is how targets are designated. And this actually imposes on us a necessity that international law needs to recognize that warfare has changed. That how do we deal with that? How do we speak about intent when you have this artificial intelligence database deciding that a Palestinian can be deemed a target, a legitimate target, based on his Facebook page and based on some of his what he writes and says on social media. And the idea that a person can be killed because somehow he was declared to be a target or a combatant based on what things that he used to write and based on certain characteristics that then are interpreted as making him affiliated with a certain group, that's scary. But that's one of the dystopian elements that we have to deal with. So this is why proving specific intent, and we can talk about that more, was indeed the most, because when it comes to factual, the actus reus, or the factual basis of the crimes, it was easier to prove. And this is why we still have many groups that say acts of genocide. And what is the difference between acts of genocide and genocide? Is they say that acts of genocide, at least the actus reus, the factual element basis of the crime, is beyond reasonable doubt. I think even some of those who are most suspicious of using the genocide charge when it comes to killings, bodily or mental harm, but particularly the conditions of life, which mean displacement, starvation, deliberate destruction of infrastructure necessary or indispensable for the survival of the population, the blockade, etc. These are easier to prove. We have so much documentation on that. Although still, as you rightly said, Peter, it's still only the tip of the iceberg. I think we'll need decades to just unveil really. And unfortunately, there are some crimes that we'll never understand what happened. There are hundreds, if not more, of people who were killed extrajudicially as they tried to cross from north to south, including people with disabilities, physical and intellectual disabilities, and then their bodies were dumped. And then their families, just when they returned, they found bones or something, like the decomposing bodies, and they couldn't recognize. There was no way to conduct autopsies. DNA testing is still not available in Gaza. We at one point, hopefully, there will be this genocide will end, and forensic anthropologists and experts will be able to get into Gaza and will be able to do DNA matching and will be able to identify, because there are people who are still missing who we don't know if they are alive or dead, and they are most likely dead. And because of the way that many of the bodies were buried just in makeshift cemeteries, it's impossible to know what happened. So then because the factual evidence was, although it took a lot of time for us, we needed to prove the factual. It wasn't easy to actually put all the facts together through our documentation. The biggest challenge was, as a legal, and with the help and the leadership of our legal team, to prove that genocide-specific intent was there in the commission of the crime of genocide.
We can go for all the actus reus if you want, but maybe I would just like to underline. So in your report, you were sort of describing the responsibility of the state. And you faced such obstacles, proving, let's say, demolition of university, churches, killing of civilians. But how difficult it is to move from state responsibility to the responsibility of each and every individual who has committed these crimes, be it genocide or war crimes, crimes against humanity, which are, I would say, genocide is denied, but these two crimes are sort of minimized in the discourse. So how difficult it is to prove an individual actually committed this crime from a factual base. Because let me just sort of provide you a standard, legal standard in Slovenian Supreme Court for arrest of an individual, and that is a reasonable suspicion, which is something similar to reasonable grounds to believe under ICC, that a specific person has committed a criminal offense when there is a high degree of articulated, concrete, and specific probability that a specific person has committed a criminal offense. The degree of suspicion must be such that the court can be convinced of its validity, even when deciding ex post facto on the legitimacy of detention, in case of detention.
Yeah, absolutely.
So legal standards are very high.
There are two elements here. First of all, you need to look at the chain of command, because you have the generals, obviously the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the different members of the war cabinet, which was later dissolved, and you have the security cabinet, and you have the soldiers who commit the war crimes or crimes against humanity on the ground. And you need then to, and you know that Israel has tried to do all that it could to shelter and shield those from responsibility. We live in such a world, I don't know whether to say fortunately or unfortunately, that some of the soldiers are so shamelessly racist that you have some of the soldiers and the officials documenting their own war crimes by their own voices. And some journalists, it's less actually, again, human rights organizations are a bit behind, but some journalists, including, for example, Yunus al-Tirawi and others, have been sifting through the Facebook pages and statuses and Telegram pages of some of these soldiers, sometimes commanders of battalions, and documenting them as they, in their faces, share pictures of them blowing up a building, dedicating that as a birthday gift for their girlfriends, for example, or just taking pictures, direct pictures. There were, after that, there were increasing numbers of orders by the Israeli military for its soldiers to stop sharing this stuff. Actually not because there was any moral or ethical problem for them with that, but just because they were worried about how these soldiers and commanders might be prosecuted. And even if not for genocide, although some of these soldiers expressed clear incitement to genocide, which is a crime under the Genocide Convention. Some of the journalists, especially those working with Channel 14, which is almost Israel's own version of Radio Rwanda, were calling for the annihilation, describing some of the ministers or the members of Knesset, like Vaturi, who said that Gaza needs to be totally erased and people need to be erased, or threatening to use a nuclear bomb in Gaza. So when it comes to responsibility of soldiers, there are the cases where you have the evidence through the very same soldiers who documented themselves, and you can use it, especially if you can manage to identify the faces, which can be a bit, and this will take, it's almost like you will need our own versions of the hunters of some of the war criminals who will need to go and look at Facebook pages. The thing is because Israel is a small country, and those who serve in the army, like, you have limited number of people, and sometimes they put identifying details with the help, and also, just to say, also the help of some incredible anti-Zionist Israeli activists who also do the translation from Hebrew and do the hunting and do the research and help with the research on that. You have almost a growing database. Now, when it comes to human rights organizations, we are more, I would say, cautious with working with this stuff, because when it comes to individuals, we can't name names unless we reach out to the persons first. And we have different standards also because there is libel, there is the danger of being sued. So we don't have as much freedom as, say, journalists or individual journalists, or people who just, like individual investigators who don't work for an international human rights organization, for example. So we usually focus on the chain of command. So this means, for example, the general of staff, the head staff at the Israeli military, those leading the attack, because they obviously, we know that even if they didn't, and of course you need to prove that they directed or they ordered. In some of the attacks it's easier to prove, because you know that, for example, when, for example, Katz directed the Israeli cabinet to do the whole-scale invasion of Gaza City, he issued the orders. Or, for example, when there was the order of Gallant, he said, I ordered electricity to be. He said, he said it himself. So it's basically an admission of committing war crime and a crime against humanity, and in the sense also because it's an indication for the commission of the crime of genocide, or one of the acts prohibited under the crime of genocide. He actually admitted that, he said that. So this is what we work with, and of course this is going to be the challenge of the International Criminal Court, because it mainly speaks about individual criminal responsibility. And right now we have it for the top of the chain of command, which is the 2 arrest warrants we have, unfortunately not for the crime of genocide, neither nor for the crime of extermination, but still for war crimes and crimes against humanity, including the use of starvation as a weapon of war, and including also the murder as a crime against humanity. But this is something that the International Criminal Court will be tasked with, and hopefully will be able to increasingly find more evidence against specific individuals.
Thank you for that insight. Maybe we could move on. So, intent to so to destroy in whole or in part a group. Could you said you had difficulties with this element, so to speak. Why?
Because for 2 things. Because as we said, you have to prove the specific intent to destroy a group, and then we know, I don't need to go into, to delve into the complex history of how, because there is a huge gap between the original conceptualization of the crime of genocide as theorized by Raphael Lemkin, the father of the genocide terminology and genocide as a legal concept, and what we have in the Genocide Convention, which is a watered-down version of what Lemkin was hoping to achieve at the time. And I highly recommend reading the book East-West Street, which kind of talks about this conflict. To me, it shouldn't exist, by the way, by Philip Sands. This conflict shouldn't exist between crimes against humanity and the crime of genocide, but somehow it was there because crimes against humanity, the genocide was seen as a more collective crime because it was a crime against a group as such, while crimes against humanity, it was not enough to even commit it against one person. You didn't need to prove the group protection or the group element of the crime. So this is the difference between, say, extermination and genocide. Extermination and genocide are almost identical in terms of the crime. They differ in intent. In extermination, you don't need to prove that there was an intent to destroy a certain group or members of a certain group because of the protected characteristics of this group. In genocide, you need to. And again, I think it's very important not to fall into that conflict, but this is how it was seen at the time. So what we have in 1948 is very limiting. First of all, while Lemkin talked about social class groups and we talked a lot about starvation and cultural groups, in the version we have religious, national, ethnic, and racial groups. So these are the 4 categories that the Genocide Convention outlines. And then when it comes to, so how we infer intent, gradually you have the International Court of Justice, recognizing that very rarely will you have a genocide plan outlined, that you will have it just what you would say the smoking evidence that you have this genocide, like you have a template of a plan drafted by a country and saying that, or a state or by individuals to say that we are going to commit genocide. So you will need to rely on direct evidence and indirect evidence. Direct evidence in the sense of statements, but not any type of statements. So for us, it needed to be statements by people, by individuals who have authority to impact the military offensive, who were directly involved in managing, coordinating, directing the military offensive happening in Gaza. So we didn't even, some of the worst type of comments that were made by lesser members of the Israeli parliament, for instance, even though they were members of the governing coalition, we did not include them in our conclusion because we reached the conclusion that these can amount to incitement to genocide, but cannot be used as indication that an intent of genocide is there. The second thing is that this genocide was taking place in the context of a war or in the context of an armed conflict. And the thing is, most modern genocides are carried out in the context of an armed conflict. They don't negate each other. That genocide, even within, of course, how a military conflict can evolve into genocide can be studied because wars, you need to prove that there are violations of the laws of war, but they differ from genocide. However, to us was how we go about, what kind of intent are we looking for, and how we go about the indirect inference of intent. So according what we looked about, especially in the ICJ jurisprudence, was, first of all, that you don't need to prove that there was only one single intent. Different intents can cohabit with each other. You can have the intent, for example, to defeat an enemy, a military enemy militarily, can coexist with the intent to destroy a group. You don't have to prove that there was only one single intent, and intent can be also, so you have this dual intent, but you also have the instrumental intent. What that means is the intent to commit genocide can be an instrument towards another end, in this case, for example, ethnic cleansing, or the emptying or the making of Gaza uninhabitable. So intent can be instrumental, and it can be cohabit with other intents. That's number one, and this is what we found in the jurisprudence. Because otherwise, if you say that genocides can only happen in contexts where there is only dominate a single intent, that means that you don't need the convention. Because the convention said in peace or in war. Genocide is prohibited in peace or in war. So the convention would have not mentioned the word in war if it assumed that genocides cannot happen during times of war. The prohibition against genocide is absolute, even as part of a military conflict or military offensive, which is what we have in the case of Gaza. Now, the next question would be, okay, so you have the statements that can be used as direct indication for us that there is the crime of genocide, but you needed to look at the different type of evidence, which is the pattern of conduct. And why the question of pattern of conduct can be complicated? Because if we want to apply the pattern of conduct in order to guide us to intent, it needs to be the only reasonable inference. And by only reasonable inference means that when you look at the totality of evidence behind you, before you, you need, and without compartmentalization, which means you have to look at the totality of evidence together, not just single bits and pieces here and there. You have to piece the puzzle all together. You need to conclude from looking at the pattern of conduct that there is only one conclusion that can be drawn, And that only conclusion, single reasonable conclusion, is that genocidal intent exists. And here, when we looked at pattern of conduct, we looked at different elements. We looked at scale, seriousness of the crimes, the repeated nature of this crime, so that, because we always, for us, was important to always consider what one would maybe call the devil's advocate version, which is we actually began from the different assumption. As a researcher who said there is no genocide. Okay, and then and we put all the different scenarios for why there is no genocide. One scenario was, okay, there were war crimes, violations, serious violations of international law, but they were part of the military conduct. They were part of the war violations that are associated with every war. We also said that there were violations, but they were the result of recklessness rather than intent, rather than deliberateness. We also considered the point that that these violations were there, but they were part of Israel's attempt to get rid of Hamas. However, then we tried to say, can we prove those? And again, sometimes it's very hard to prove a negation. However, what we end up doing is, we looked especially here the issue of conditions of life. And I would like to stop at this because this is really crucial. Because when it comes, especially when the killings are mostly done through airstrikes, sometimes you can say, but maybe they thought that there was a legitimate target in there. Okay, they were reckless in deciding to target that place, but this is recklessness or negligence is not the same as intent. However, even with that, you can say recklessness when it's one attack, 10 attacks, 100 attacks. Can you really say recklessness about something that is so systematically repeated? So as the type, and when you know that those who are perpetrating, carrying out the airstrikes, carrying them using weapons that are known to cause maximum amount of killings. And they are known, and they could have, if they really needed to target one specific individual, there were other ways to target him without causing this huge civilian casualty. And the time of the targeting, that these targetings were happening at times where these places were full of civilians, sleeping civilians at home, against residential targets, against residential neighborhoods.
Where is daddy policy? The operation, where is daddy? So it's called like attacking individuals.
That's one, yeah, exactly. Waiting until that person gets back home and the home is full, and then bombing that home. And you look at it and on so many other cases, and then, for example, saying it's for certain people, even, by the way, who are not combatants, who, for example, are members of the civilian side of the Hamas government, or journalists who work with media that, for Israel, said they are Hamas-run, or whatever that can mean, by the way. That's the broadening of what can be deemed as legitimate target. So as to almost include people who, for example, may have went to the streets on the 7th of October, or some actual people who had phones in their vicinity that Israel said were stolen during the 7th of October attacks. The stories of some of the cases that we looked at are endless, right? But, and then, so this is why you can't really say, and then you look at the weapons used, and you look at the timing, and then you look at the manner in which these attacks were carried out, and the fact that they were carried out over such an extended period of time, and the neglect or recklessness element doesn't hold sway. And even if it was just recklessness, quote-unquote recklessness, you will have, okay, so you look at the other indications. So did any of those reckless attackers, was any of those reckless, between inverted commas, airstrikes investigated? Has anyone been held? Like in the Israeli military, you have soldiers who were prosecuted for violating Sabbath rules and eating and violating kosher rules in the military, and not people who committed, and not people who directed, soldiers who directed airstrikes that killed hundreds of people, which is astonishing to think about. Because if you want to, even to try to pretend that you have a system in place that can investigate the crimes, obviously when it comes, they say they punish, or they say we have strict rules against looting from Palestinian homes. But has any of the massive serious killings been investigated? And even if it has been investigated, has it been prosecuted? And has those who committed this have been held accountable? And so far, we don't have any evidence since the 7th of October 2023, although there are supposedly tens of cases where the Israeli military, the mechanism in the Israeli military responsible for looking into violations, has opened cases. We don't have, with the exception of one commander who was admonished, but ultimately he was also promoted. And we have this. So this gives you an evidence and an indication that this is not just recklessness. But again, with killings, especially because of the nature of the killings, it can be, you can at least argue, although it's very, very, to me, fragile, this argument, that there are other reasons, or other than that there are just disproportionate or indiscriminate or deliberate attacks that are part of war crimes, crimes against humanity, rather than genocide. We don't agree with this argument, but with the deliberate imposition of conditions of life, you cannot argue that. Why? Because you see when you look, and this is what we learned, by the way, because to me, I studied at an Israeli unit, just as an aside, I studied at an Israeli university. So to me, I always was put in the place where I was questioned about why do you say that Israel commits war crimes? So I always kind of had to deal with this devil's advocate thing and had to debate. So for me, it was never, I was never about just talking to the converted. It kind of put the intellectual onus on you all the time, which can be really tough, but you are under the intellectual onus always to prove the opposite of what you are accused of denying. And then what we as team, with the guidance of our legal experts did, is look at this whole picture together. So we look at 3 patterns of conditions of life, which are the deliberate destruction of infrastructure essential to the survival of the population. There we looked at roads, at hospitals, healthcare systems, and healthcare sectors, fertility clinics, other types of clinics necessary for the operation, and the percentage of hospitals that were targeted, agricultural territories and agricultural lands. As evidence, also we looked at the destruction, although the destruction of cultural spaces, religious, cultural heritage is not per se a genocidal act, but they can give you an indication to the intent of the perpetrator to erase the existence of this group, because we know that these groups cannot exist without this cultural legacy, how important it is as defining part of their existence. And you have the mass displacement under inhumane conditions, especially through the issuance of so-called evacuation or displacement orders, ever shrinking the space of Gaza where people can live, including forcing people to go into unsanitary, unhygienic places where the Israeli military knows very well that human beings cannot even live there. That it's impossible for a human being to live there. And then the third was the denial of entry of life-saving aid or restrictions. And we have several examples of full sieges, including one siege from the 2nd of March until the 19th of May, 2025, 78 days when Israel refused to allow anything into Gaza, including insulin, anything, everything was denied from entry into Gaza. And you look at how each and every single one of these patterns compounded the impact of each other. The way that they were played out together, and you look at them in conjunction with the serious injuries that Israeli attacks were creating, and the mass killings that were happening every day, and you see how engineered the process is, and you see, for example, that the mix, that this toxic, really, mix of disease and hunger is not simply a byproduct of war, an unfortunate byproduct of war. It is the intended consequence of implementing, designing, and directing these acts and policies and omissions over the 22 months in a way that Israel knows that a population cannot survive. And especially with the conditions of the destruction of life, in that case, you don't even need to prove that the killings happen, by the way. You just need to prove that these conditions were created to make life unlivable for the population. And this is what you need to prove. In, for example, causing bodily or mental harm, it's enough to prove one case. Obviously, we have thousands upon thousands of cases. But then you look at the starvation, and some of the elements, some of the claims that Israel tries to deny the deliberateness of its starvation campaign, or that it's actually starvation, are so eugenics-based and so ridiculous that sometimes I don't know if we should even try to disprove them. Sometimes I think we are too much trapped into trying to disprove or trying to prove that Israel is not telling the truth. But I think it's just stopping at one example. How does Israel say, when we say that starvation is part and parcel of the crime of genocide and that it's deliberate and that infants are dying of starvation? They say, but they have pre-existing conditions. And as if a child with pre-existing condition it's okay for this child to die of starvation. And again, this is so eugenics because we know that these conditions of life are designed at the start to target the most vulnerable parts of the population, which means children, especially children with pre-existing conditions, people with disabilities, people with pre-existing illnesses, and older people. These are the people who are most vulnerable to these conditions. So, of course, the imposition of these conditions affects those more than anyone else. And so you don't need to prove that this child does not have other pre-existing conditions. I was so infuriated when the New York Times said, we have discovered that this child had another pre-existing condition. These children were living with these pre-existing conditions before the genocide. They had the social fabric to protect them. They had a struggling healthcare system because of the Israeli blockade, but still a functional healthcare system to protect them. They had the family to protect them. They have hygiene. They have social solidarity, and this, by the way, cannot be underestimated because mutual aid in Gaza was such an important factor, especially in the protection to older people. Even during COVID, by the way, people in Gaza still cared for vast majority of families refused to even send their ill parents into old person's house because it was unheard of. We want to take care of our parents. They did everything to protect their older parents. So these systems were able to protect these people who are most vulnerable. Now, all these systems collapsed after the war. And preventable illnesses developed and mutated into illnesses into illnesses that cause death. Very moderate injury. People now in Gaza are dying of moderate injuries because Israel refused to allow antibiotics. Like, how can you possibly explain the fact that Israel continues to blanket deny organizations to get into Gaza antibiotics? I don't know, can antibiotics, if there are military experts here, they can say that, do you think antibiotics can be used by Hamas to manufacture rockets? I don't know, maybe.
Or insulin, double use.
Or insulin, or baby formula. Like some of the things that Israel has restricted, or ICU beds. So many, or some of the nutrient supplements, there is no way you can understand some of the things that were prevented from entering Gaza. Or vegetables, because like at the time when Israel allows Nutella into Gaza through commercial supplies, they are denying tomatoes and vegetables, or restricting, or inventing bureaucratic explanations for why they won't let some of the stuff in. And you see the stuff that these organizations have stored, just waiting for the approval of Israeli authorities to get in. And it's not getting in. So you look at that, and yes, there are the vulnerable people with disabilities and people with existing illnesses who would, again, I insist, these people had been living their life. Yes, they had been struggling before the genocide also due to Israel's blockade, but they had been living. But when Israel comes and destroys the only dialysis center, or the only hospital specialized with treating cancer patients, and at the same time, as it destroyed the only hospital specifically treating cancer patients, it prevents cancer patients from leaving Gaza to receive treatment outside Gaza, including to receive treatment in the West Bank. And at the same time, it forced some of the cancer patients who had been receiving treatment in the West Bank before 7th of October to go back to Gaza. And at the same time, it knows that there is no chemotherapy available in Gaza. And the instruments required for chemotherapy are not allowed into Gaza. So there is a deliberate attempt to kill all cancer patients, basically. Because, and it's the same for kidney patients. Unfortunately, the overwhelming majority of people especially with non-functioning kidneys who require dialysis in Gaza, most of them have died. And these deaths are not registered as conflict-related deaths, by the way. They're not counted among the 62,000 Palestinians killed that the Ministry of Health estimates. So many of the deaths that we need to think about are not even counted because there are deaths by illnesses, but these illnesses could have and would have and should have easily been treated and coexisted with had it not been for the conditions of life that were deliberately imposed by Israel. So when you look at this whole picture together with the bombardment, relentless bombardment, and together with the fact that hospitals are overwhelmed by the sheer number of injuries, and together with the mental harm being inflicted on the population, on the family, through mass displacement, through torture, through blocking any kind of end to this horror, you reach a full picture of how each and every one of these acts complement and compound the devastating impact of each other. And you cannot, if looked at separately, one may say, for the sake of discussion, that maybe these are not deliberate. But when looked at together, there is only one reasonable conclusion, that these acts are committed in order to destroy the very social fabric and existence of Palestinians in Gaza as such.
Thank you. It breaks my heart because we're running out of time, and because I really wanted not to turn a blind eye to the West Bank, the encroachment on the rights of the Palestinians living there. But this is such an extreme limit that I hope that we'll be able to speak about it in the Q&A section. And maybe we can move on to the last part, and that is going from how to why. How to bridge the us versus them divide, which is clear in the Israeli and Palestinian society, and being and knowing both aspects of the Israeli and the Palestinian society, and moving from the legal aspect. I think this is crucial at this point. What do you think? What can be done, or what needs to be done in order to break this or bridge this us versus them divide?
It's a very difficult question because it requires, I think, in this context, we cannot start any process of recovery and healing and restorative justice without actual justice. Like, this is why I tend to be very suspicious, me as Budour and also Amnesty, about the whole concept of transitional justice. Because I think I'm very preoccupied, and kind of, I think this is maybe one attempt by me to flee, not to think about what this will do to Palestinians, because I think the impact of everything that we had, just to mention that my grandparents who survived the Nakba and who lived under military rule still have, as I was watching them get older, they still have the trauma of the Nakba etched, which expressed itself in my parents, and which supposedly they say also expressed itself in us. In the way we panic about certain things, we don't know why we panic about them. When we hear certain sounds, when we hear certain voices, and when we think about certain things that have to do with time or we are afraid of doing something even though it's totally reasonable, for me, I can't, sometimes it takes me time to go to a place where I don't have to worry about certain things that in Palestine we have to worry about. It shocks me. Some of the normalcies, I struggle to, and again, I'm talking about, in my experience, I'm incredibly, extremely privileged. And imagine those who are not, which are the majority of Palestinians. But to think now what this would be to Palestinians in Gaza, in particular, what this would be for Palestinians in the West Bank who were displaced. Maybe you said West Bank. I really need to go back to the one and acknowledge one recent brutal killing that happened, because he's a very dear friend of us as Amnesty. He's a very good friend of me personally. He's someone I learned from so much. Aoud al-Hadhalin. He's an activist from Al Khair in the West Bank, in the South Hebron Hills. He's a relative of one of our very dear friend, Eid al-Hadhalin, the only vegan Bedouin in the world. And they have been fighting. I remember the first time I went to Al Khair and they taught me how to plow the land. And to me, that was incredible, because they immediately recognized, yes, I have disabilities, and sometimes this community is conservative. But then you say, yeah, you can do everything that we can do, and they started teaching me. And when the settlers came, I remember they one time tried to hide me from the soldiers in one of the caves in the village. So this is a community I know very well. And I know how tight-knit this community is. The father of Eid himself, Haji Sliman, was killed by the Israeli military a few years back. And Aouda was killed by an Israeli settler. We know who that settler is. That settler was blacklisted by the EU. And he filmed his own killing. The murderer, was allowed freely. He was released, first on bail to house arrest, and later was released to continue harassing the community of Al Khair. And not only was Aouda murdered in cold blood, not only was the act of killing him was part of the state-sponsored, state-backed settler killings of Palestinians that happened, and destruction of life of Palestinians in the West Bank. One of the most painful aspects, we went to Al Khair to attend the funeral, to pay condolences to Aouda's family. We were not allowed into the village because it was declared as closed military zone. Only limited number of people were allowed to attend the funeral. No flags were allowed to be raised. No chanting was allowed, not even a farewell. His body was withheld as punishment for a week. Hold a body of a person held in order to ensure that his family doesn't hold a massive funeral for him. And then even when his body was allowed, we were not even allowed to say goodbye, Auda, or to honor him as he really deserved. He didn't want a quiet, I'm sure he wanted to live. He's a father of 3 children. But even that was denied. And that's just one example of what everyday life, even in the context that is not genocide, but that's a slow, which is not slow anymore, process of annihilation. And I would like to think that with us there were some activists, including mainly anti-Zionist Israeli activists, who are such a small minority. But I try to see that they represent a beacon of hope. Because they are there, they learn, by the way, some of them can take time for them to decolonize their own mindsets and to learn that they are not there to save the Palestinians, but they should be there to do active solidarity, which means accept and acknowledge that they are the ones who learn from Palestinians, not who dictate to Palestinians what Palestinians should do. But they are there, they are willing to learn, they are willing to change. Some of them are not, but many are willing to do that, to do protective presence, to do things that can actually help Palestinians, to actually use their privilege as Jewish white Israelis to help Palestinians in there. Sometimes, and increasingly, they are also being beaten and brutalized by the Israeli system, which, and we see how the boomerang effect, because some of the abuses currently being committed in the West Bank will find their way into being committed against Israeli Jews inside Israel, by the way, and we see it. So these can help bridge the divide between us and them, but only, and this is because it's not just, because the problem is not that we have some sort of disagreement over what your favorite food is. This is not what we have. We have a context of apartheid, occupation, genocide in Gaza, a context also committed within the colonial context, the settler colonial context that characterizes Israel's occupation of us. Anyone, in order to bridge that, there needs to be a recognition by Israelis that this is happening. There needs to be acknowledgement, and there needs to be also accountability. And without these processes, you cannot bridge, because you cannot, the idea that you can just discuss, come together for hummus and falafel and lovely dinner in the park, and not ask yourself, so this park was established on the stolen land of Palestinians. And without asking yourself how Israelis are actively privileged at the expense of Palestinians. This needs to happen. We cannot talk about any form of learning or mutual struggle. Mutual struggle can happen and shared struggle can happen, but it needs to be shared struggle, not some form of watered down, wishy-washy coexistence that equates the oppressor with the oppressed. So if that happens, and still a tiny minority, I draw courage from they are few but brave 18-year-old conscientious objectors who say we don't want to serve for an army that commits genocide in Gaza. Guys like Itamar, for example, who refused to serve in the Israeli military and who continues to protest, and he was jailed for refusing, and who says, I cannot even compare my plight to the Palestinian people. It pales in comparison. That gives me hope. It's still like we need, in our condition, we need to almost dig. Like it's almost, the work of finding hope is almost like an excavation. You need to look so deep down. It's an archaeology of hope, I would say. You need to look deep, but you need to look at it, but it can only happen if we have this radical commitment towards justice that doesn't equate between oppressor and oppressed.
Budour, thank you so much. With such an eloquence, I could listen to you the whole day. But sadly, we're running out of time, and I would like to open the floor for other people to ask some questions they would like to, and maybe you can raise hands and.
Or criticism, or whatever you think I missed or messed up?
Nothing. Right.
Thank you very much. There will be absolutely no criticism, just sincere thanks for everything that you've shared and the clarity that you've gave us. My question regards the complicity in genocide, and I would like to ask more if you can share with us your analysis and thoughts on the complicity of private actors, especially private actors based outside of Israel in this genocide and other crimes, as highlighted in inter alia report of Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese, the last one, from the economy of occupation to the economy of genocide, especially maybe with regard for what you were telling us about the targeting, the automatic targeting. So I'm interested especially in the complicity accusation of those companies that provide information for this extreme surveillance of Palestinians that is now being used also for one of the, or more of the actus reus of genocide. And for example, what other countries could do in that regard, not only with direct sanctions towards Israel, but also through some actions against those private actors complicit in genocide. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we take a round or answer each question?
Maybe another one, so, because,
Hi, I would just have a question about how important do you feel it is to use the universal jurisdiction also to prosecute the individual soldiers in different countries. Something we have seen has been starting to pick up, and how much do you see there is actual possibility for national legal systems to follow up on this? Thank you.
I think we can have these two questions.
Yeah. I'll start with the second. I think as long as we, first of all, we had to do the intellectual work of situating, because we don't want to, it's important that we understand that these individual soldiers are part of a system. So it's not just few bad apples here and there. These bad apples were planted, were given the ideal, had the ideal climate to do what they did. So to me, intellectually, it's very important, even as we share and give examples of what individual soldiers do, recognize that these individual soldiers are the face of something, but they are not the only ones. Those are the ones that we happen to see or identify as committing certain crimes, but it's not, they're not the, they're almost a symptom of the problem, because rather than the root cause of the problem. But second, yes, I think using extraterritorial, for example, first of all, soldiers who hold other citizenships, who are dual citizens, which are easier to prosecute if they happen, and their countries have to take, and this, by the way, this was done in other cases, especially with those who went to fight with ISIS. And there is no reason whatsoever that this should not be done also with the Israeli soldiers who hold dual citizenship. But not only dual citizenship, we know that there are crimes against humanity, including genocide and genocide, that have universal jurisdiction or extraterritorial jurisdiction, depending on the country's legal system and the norms it has in terms of legal norms. But I think, yes, the idea of, to me, I would like to think about it this way. We know that Israel has always made Gaza unsafe, that has made nowhere safe in Gaza. We always say that there is nowhere safe for Palestinians in Gaza to go. And to me, it's very important to reach a reality where there is nowhere immune, that there is nowhere where these soldiers can go that they can enjoy impunity. That they need to know, because they need to know that what actions that they committed have prices, even have a price. Even if this, to me, I look at this way, even if this does not end in a conviction, or if these soldiers are not charged, the very knowledge that if they go to countries that exercise universal jurisdiction, and that if they are suspected of committing war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, that they can be charged and prosecuted, that's huge to me. Because it also, because it challenges, it puts some bricks in the walls of impunity. And the fact that we saw the example of Belgium, we are seeing several cases where there is still happening, and where the courts will have to deal with this question. And I think this is important. Some organizations do very good work on that. And this is, I think, in terms of you taking advantage of all the legal avenues that you have is really important. In addition to other like legal battles, for example, filing cases against arms exportation, or against companies that supply Israel with arms, or against states that continue to trade arms with Israel. Even if these cases don't end up in convictions, they exhaust the countries. The countries know that they have a question, they have to answer for that. And I think that is important as a first step. Regarding the question of complicity, even before we reached genocide, we were always, the issue of companies complicit in human rights violations of Palestinians, including in settlement, which is a war crime, including in apartheid, which is a crime against humanity, has been a big issue and has been one of the things that we were trying to, again, because it's very difficult to do, in our world, it's always very difficult to make change. With companies, you can shame them. So for example, I'll just give one example. At Amnesty, with the help of our section in North Korea, we worked on the issue of Hyundai. Hyundai supplies the state of Israel, and through a subcontractor based in Israel, with machinery that then is used in destroying Palestinian homes in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, or that is used to build illegal Israeli settlements. And then we found evidence, clear evidence of Hyundai equipment being used in destroying Palestinian homes, which is, and basically contributing to forcible transfer, which is a crime against humanity. And then we use what we have is guiding principles on business and human rights, which establish that corporations have a duty to take all due diligence measures to avoid that their products are committed or are used in the commission of war crimes. And they have to show that they have a clear standard that they apply, that they have a human rights standard in that. Now, we know that ultimately companies think about profit, right? And this is the main motive. Most companies don't really care about human rights. But we know also that shaming these companies, exposing these companies' complicity and violations of international law can force them, in order to protect their trademark, not to supply. So they are pushed, motivated by different elements other than human rights, but it's important to work on that. When it comes to genocide, it's a different ball game altogether, because, and this is why, one reason why states continue to refuse to say genocide, because complicity with genocide is a crime, is one of the prohibited acts prohibited under the Genocide Convention. Of course, it too requires proving intent, so you have to prove that a party, be it a private actor or state actor, being complicit in genocide, intends, that there is the intent element to commit genocide. And this can be also inferred from knowing, which when it comes to the US, for example, is easier to prove. And when it comes to, for example, companies that supply arms, supply the bombs that kill Palestinians, or the methods, the technology that used to surveil Palestinians, and for example, we're talking about companies, also other companies, you do, obviously you'll have, as an organization, as Amnesty, this is something that we are working on, also following the lead of Rapporteur Albanese's excellent report, to try to also push through that, because we believe that this avenue of complicity, possible complicity in genocide of private actors on other human rights violations, including war crimes, is a very important avenue to keep pushing. And to keep showing that these companies, that you cannot profit off the crimes committed against Palestinians. We know it's very difficult, and also we know that there are the possibility of being sued for libel always, so this is why it can take more time. You have to send the companies a summary of your conclusions. You have to show that you have done your own due diligence in your research, but I think it's a very, very important avenue to pursue, and we should continue pursuing that, definitely.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, or maybe two, right? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to ask two questions, but I hope that they're not necessarily very long ones. One is, what can legal consequences be for states complicit in genocide? And the other is, you have said before that Palestinian scholars and activists have named the apartheid in Palestine long ago, and they also were probably the first to name the genocide. But now there are Israeli human rights organizations also saying these words, and I imagine it's frustrating, but there is also, it also seems important from a sort of a PR point of view that they say that, so I wanted to have your take on that.
Maybe the last, yeah, you can take them in a bundle.
Yeah.
I don't know, thank you. So I would just like to very quickly contextualize what is actually the situation in Slovenia. I looked at the imports in 2024 when all of this, what you were explaining, was happening, really flared up. So the trade is diesel and avocados. That makes half of the trade. These are not essential commodities. So what I want to ask is more about like these examples where we're not directly exporting or importing machinery, but there is an obvious extractionist mechanism here. So what kind of, at least in the sense of legal accountability, is there in such a case when it's just really kind of disgusting to even continue trading when you know the underlying systems that are behind that?
Thank you. So to answer quickly the question, so in terms of legal consequences, we know that when you look at Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, and when you look at the crimes that are punished, you have several types of article, but you have also complicity in genocide as one of the acts that can be punished that are prohibited under the Genocide Convention. So states that are complicit in the Genocide Convention, in the commission of genocide, are committing acts prohibited under the Genocide Convention, which means that they are also can be charged with genocide, just as incitement to genocide. And that's huge, even if that doesn't, again, lead to conviction, because of the threshold and the standard of proving beyond reasonable doubt, and if you want to do the criminally prosecuting certain states for complicity, I know that with the ICJ, there is another ICJ case, by the way. There have been attempts to charge Germany by Nicaragua of being complicit in genocide. That was dismissed because they used also the other for technical reasons. But there is another case between that where Sudan filed against the UAE for complicity in genocide. And this is an interesting case because obviously the UAE is directly arming and supporting the rapid support forces in Sudan, which are committing genocide in Sudan. So I think there are the legal consequences. If you are complicit in genocide, then you are violating the Genocide Convention. And also, I think there are moral consequences, which, to me, I know states are not necessarily moral actors in that sense, but it's very important also the states that will still up to date. It's a huge discussion. I know it's also in Slovenia and many other contexts about states that were complicit in the genocide against the Jews, against the Roma, against people with disabilities, against other groups that were mass murdered during the Second World War and before that. And this is a huge discussion that we will continue to have, defining what accountability is for genocide, be it legal or moral or social response accountability. Regarding your question, yes, it's always been frustrating for Palestinians that it's almost you need the Israeli organization to come out and say it in order to validate what Palestinians, or the international, to validate what Palestinians had been saying for a very long time. I try, and this is part of me that kind of maybe the results of aging and growing up, to always try, because we have so little hope left, to always look at the positive side, is that how you can take advantage of these reports. First, by insisting that these should not be used in order to silence Palestinians, or that they should not somehow have primacy over what Palestinians say, and we should refuse this hierarchy of who gets, of refusing that Palestinians can and are reliable narrators of their own experiences, and they should not be somehow demoted compared to what the neutral Israeli expert says. But also, on the other hand, understand the value of such reports, also to move public opinion, to force others to hear Palestinians, to get to spaces that you would probably, so to think about it tactically, I think reports by B'Tselem, by Physicians for Human Rights, but also by Holocaust experts, even though I personally have some, especially with some disagreements with the way some of them understand genocide. But again, you can argue and disagree, but I think they have their own value, and it's really important. In terms of how we can, and I hope I got the question right, and how, for example, a state can make sure that it has the mechanisms to enforce decisions when it comes to exporting arms, or when it comes to trade with settlements. I think with every decisions on arms embargo or on selling or trade with settlements are really important, but they are only important if they are enforced. They are symbolically important if they are on paper, but they're hugely important if they are enforced. Even if done by smaller countries or by countries that are not necessarily Israel's biggest allies or biggest source of trade, but they are really important if they are enforced. And I know that every country has mechanisms in place, due diligence mechanisms in place, to ensure, for example, that if it takes the decision to ban exporting arms or transiting arms, that it has the duty and obligation to make sure that this is enforced. Same with, for example, selling stuff or selling or trade with settlements. It has the duty to ensure that, for example, products are not mislabeled, because some of the product can be mislabeled by the Israeli exporters. They can be exported as products from Israel when they are products from settlements. So this due diligence is on the states that do take the very important decisions to ban, be it trade with settlements or arms, or also supplying quote-unquote civilian equipment that then is used in, or parts or pieces of this equipment that then is used in order to violate Palestinian rights, including commit war crimes, that the due diligence is respected, that there are clear, consistent mechanisms of monitoring, of upholding, of making sure that if there are violations, these violations are addressed. And the also important issue of not just canceling future licenses, but also really talking about licenses that were already approved. Because this, in terms of retroactive treatment of if there are contracts that already been made, because this had been, the trade with settlement was unlawful even before a decision to ban it is in place, because it's a violation of international law. So the fact that, for example, a shipment of arms or a sale of or a trade with settlement contract was done before a decision by any state is reached, that doesn't mean that previous or already existing contracts are legal. These pre-existing contracts are themselves illegal because they are violations of international law. So I think if this is done, this really will give a huge value to all the decisions and make it beyond the symbolic value, which is important, but it's not enough. You need symbolic, but symbolic is not enough. You need also practical and especially enforcement.
Budour, thank you very much. It's been an honor talking to a person who has such a profound knowledge of both law and facts, and who is able to present this with such an eloquence. And in a way, I think the message you send is that eventually it may seem hopeless to fix something, to make something better, but in the end we have nothing else but to try.
Yeah.
And
Keep fighting the good fight.
yeah.